The initials stopped him cold. 2 letters, carved faintly into the wood beneath 50 years of worn varnish. So small a person could spend a lifetime walking past them without ever knowing they were there. M.D. Jack Thompson's hand came up slowly and touched the stock of the rifle. His fingers trembled, not from age, not from cold, but from the particular trembling that comes when the past reaches through time and grabs you by the throat in the middle of a dusty pawn shop in Millbrook, Tennessee. Rex pressed his gray muzzle hard against Jack's left hand and held it there. The dog always knew. Jack stood perfectly still, while the world around him, the cluttered shelves, the burnt coffee smell, the young man behind the counter scrolling his phone, all of it dissolved like morning fog burning off a river. And for one shattering moment, Jack Thompson was 22 years old again. Welcome back to Jack and Rex Tales, where every story is about the people who served, the bonds that never break, and the quiet grace that finds us when we need it most. The rain had started an hour earlier, soft and steady against the windows of the small shop, the kind of rain that makes a town feel smaller and older than it is. Jack had parked his truck at the curb and sat for a moment before going in, one hand resting on Rex's broad back, watching the water streak down the glass of the pawnshop door. He was 74 years old. His knees ached in the damp. His hands, wrapped around the steering wheel, carried the particular roughness of a man who had spent his life doing things that left marks. But there was still something in the way he sat, the posture, the stillness, the eyes that moved across every reflection and doorway without appearing to, that didn't match the age. Some things training puts into a man so deep they never come back out. Some habits never leave a Navy SEAL. "Just a minute, buddy," he'd told Rex. The dog had looked at him with those cloudy brown eyes and waited patiently, like time was something Rex had made his peace with long ago. Now they stood at the back of the shop, in front of a Remington 700 that had no business being here. Jack's trained eyes had found it the moment he stepped through the door, between a fishing rod rack and a silent jukebox, leaning against the wall like something that had simply been misplaced. Most people would have seen scratches and faded wood and an old gun past its useful life. Jack saw the handmade cheek rest, shaped and sanded by someone who learned through hard experience that factory equipment got men killed in bad light. He saw the field-modified suppressor threading. He saw the scope mount, specific, unmistakable, used by early SEAL sniper teams operating near the Mekong Delta in the years when the war was supposed to be winding down, but no one had told the enemy. And then he saw the initials, M.D. Michael Donovan, Mick, the man with the loudest laugh in the whole United States Navy, the kind of laugh that filled rooms, that carried across water, that made other men laugh without knowing why. The man who could sleep anywhere, on a riverbank, in a foxhole, across the hard, vibrating floor of a Huey punching through monsoon weather, and wake up grinning like he'd just had the finest night of his life. The man who used to say that fear was just excitement that hadn't figured itself out yet. The man who pressed this rifle into Jack's hands on the worst night of both their lives. Rex made a soft sound beside him, not quite a whimper, something quieter and more private, the sound he made in the deep of the night when Jack's breathing changed and the old dog understood that his person had gone somewhere unreachable. He pressed the full weight of his graying body against Jack's leg and stayed there. Jack barely felt it. He was already gone. The jungle rain came down in warm, heavy sheets that turned the riverbank into chaos. Muzzle flash erupted from 3 directions at once, and the air was filled with the specific horrible sound of rounds tearing through wet vegetation inches from living men. Jack was low in the mud, moving, when Mick appeared out of the smoke beside him. The extraction helicopter was already pulling away overhead. The pilot had no choice. None of them had any choice that night. 2 men were already down, and the one still breathing had seconds, not minutes. Mick's eyes were calm. That was what Jack had never been able to put down in 52 years of trying. Not the noise, not the blood or the heat or the smell of the air. The absolute calm in Mick Donovan's eyes as he shoved the rifle hard into Jack's chest and gripped his arm. "Don't let them forget us, brother." He said it like a man completing a task he had already thought through fully, like a man who had already decided and just needed the handoff to be clean. He squeezed Jack's arm once. Then he turned back toward the gunfire, drawing it, pulling it away from Jack and the 2 surviving men, buying them the seconds they needed to reach the water. Mick Donovan never came home. Rex's cold nose drove hard into Jack's palm. The pawn shop came back slowly. Dust, leather, burnt coffee, rain on glass. Jack stood very still and breathed. "You interested in that thing?" The young man behind the counter had finally looked up. Brad, mid-20s, gold chain, the patient expression of someone who has learned to wait out old men with stories. Jack's voice came out steadier than he felt. "How much?" 200. Jack looked at him carefully. "Where did it come from?" Brad shrugged. "Storage auction, probably belonged to some dead hunter." Rex growled, low and slow, from somewhere deep in his chest. Jack touched the dog's collar gently, easy. He looked back at the rifle for a moment before speaking. "You know what this is?" Brad offered the small, tolerant smile. "An old gun?" "No," Jack said quietly. "It isn't." Something in the way he said it reached Brad without Jack intending it to. The young man sat up slightly straighter. Jack pointed toward the stock. That rifle was carried by a Navy SEAL sniper team in Vietnam in 1971. Every modification on it is handmade and field-specific. You won't find any of it in a catalog because it wasn't made in a factory. It was made by men in a jungle who were trying to stay alive. He paused. The initials carved into the wood belonged to a chief petty officer named Michael Donovan. He was 23 years old. Brad glanced at the rifle and then back at Jack. The tolerant smile had gone. He died saving 6 men during an ambush near the Mekong Delta. Jack's voice remained low and even, the way men speak when they have said a thing so many times inside their own heads that the words have worn smooth. His family got a folded flag and a letter. This rifle was never recovered. The room was quiet except for the rain. Brad opened his mouth and then closed it. "I just thought it was... I didn't know," he said finally. "I know you didn't," Jack said. There was no anger in it. There had never been anger. Only the deep and lasting exhaustion of a man who had spent his whole life watching the world fail to understand, and long since accepted that as simply the way of things. He nodded once and walked out into the rain. That night, the storm rolled across Millbrook in long, slow waves. Jack sat alone in his cabin while Rex slept near the fireplace, his old sides rising and falling in the warm light. An ancient cassette player on the shelf crackled softly. Vietnam-era radio transmissions Jack had found at an estate sale years ago. Fragments of voice and static, and the sound of young men talking through fear like it was just the weather. He held the photograph in both hands. 4 young seals beside a river patrol boat, squinting into hard jungle light. All of them smiling. Mick on the far left with his arm thrown around Jack's shoulders, his mouth open mid-laugh, the laugh that could fill any room he walked into. Of the 4 men in that photograph, Jack was the only one who had come home. He had spent 52 years trying to understand what to do with that. "Found your rifle, brother," he whispered. Rex lifted his chin from the floor and walked slowly across the room with the careful dignity of an old animal who understood that every crossing of a room was worth doing gently. He rested his muzzle on Jack's knee and looked up at him with steady, clouded eyes that held no judgment and no urgency, just presence, just faithfulness. The only kind of company that had never asked Jack to be anything other than what he was. Jack sat with the dog and the photograph and the rain for a long time. Then he rose and went to the closet and brought down a metal box he hadn't opened in over 20 years. Inside were medals he never wore and documents from a life he had mostly closed the door on. And one card, soft with age, the writing still clear. Colonel David Mercer, Naval Special Warfare Historical Foundation. Jack stared at it. Then he picked up the phone. Brad uploaded the photos the next morning without giving it much thought. Vintage military rifle, cool collectible, $200. He'd sold stranger things. By afternoon, the post had moved across 3 military collector forums. By evening, it had reached veteran groups across the country. A retired SEAL in Coronado recognized the scope mount immediately. An older man in Virginia recognized the initials and sat very still at his kitchen table for a long time before picking up his phone. By nightfall, thousands of people were asking the same question. How did Mick Donovan's rifle end up in a storage auction in Tennessee? 3 black SUVs rolled quietly into Millbrook the following afternoon and parked in front of the pawn shop. Brad was alone behind the counter. He watched through the window as the doors opened and sharply dressed men stepped out with the particular unhurried movement of people who are accustomed to rooms going quiet when they enter them. The man who came through the door first was tall and silver-haired, with a stillness about him that wasn't quite calm and wasn't quite coldness, but something forged from decades of discipline so deep it had simply become the man. Colonel David Mercer, retired, unmistakable. Behind him came Jack, and beside Jack, Rex. Brad stood up. Mercer didn't look at him. His eyes went straight to the back wall, and he walked toward the rifle with the same quiet, deliberate movement Jack had used 2 days before. The walk of a man approaching something that deserves to be approached carefully. He lifted it in both hands, turned it slowly, examined every modification in silence while the room held its breath. His jaw tightened. "Dear God," he said quietly. He looked at Jack. "You were right." Jack said nothing. Mercer set the rifle on the counter and turned to Brad. His voice was measured and precise, the voice of a man who had given difficult information to people who needed to receive it clearly. Chief Petty Officer Michael Donovan, killed in action 1971 during classified reconnaissance operations near the Mekong Delta. He drew enemy fire away from 6 surviving team members so they could reach extraction. He paused, awarded the Navy Cross posthumously. His family was told the rifle was lost. Brad's eyes moved from Mercer to the rifle and back. "The man standing beside you," Mercer said, "was on that riverbank. He was the last person to see Michael Donovan alive." Turned slowly toward Jack, and this time he truly looked at him. Not the worn jacket, or the slow walk, or the quiet manner. He looked at the man carrying 52 years of something so heavy it had shaped the way he moved through every room he had ever entered. He looked at the hands that had held Mick Donovan's rifle in a jungle while the helicopters pulled away. He looked at the eyes of a man who had come home when his brothers hadn't, and had been trying ever since to justify that fact. Rex sat beside Jack without moving, steady and watchful, like a guardian who had taken his post long ago and never once considered leaving it. Something broke open in Brad's chest. He reached under the counter without speaking and set $200 on the glass and pushed it across with both hands. He couldn't give anything back that actually mattered. He understood that, but he needed to do something with his hands because he didn't know what to do with what he was feeling. "Please," he said. His voice was unsteady. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." Jack looked at the money for a long moment, then at Brad. "Keep it," he said quietly. "You didn't know. Now you do." It landed harder than any anger could have. Mercer lifted the rifle and held it toward Jack. Jack looked at it for a long time. His hand moved toward it and stopped just short, hovering in the air between reaching and releasing, between holding on and finally, after all these years, letting something go in the right direction. "It belongs with the men who never came home," he said. 3 months later, on a warm Friday evening in Fort Pierce, Florida, the National Navy SEAL Museum unveiled a new exhibit. At the center stood Mick Donovan's rifle, restored and mounted behind glass. Beside it, a photograph, 4 young men squinting into jungle light, one of them laughing with his whole body, his arm around the man beside him, like the world was something to hold on to and celebrate rather than survive. Below the display, a brass plaque read, "In honor of those who served in silence and sacrificed in shadows." Jack sat in the back row in a plain dark jacket, no medals. Rex lay at his feet with his chin on his paws, watching the room with the patient calm of an old dog who has learned that most of what matters in life happens quietly and without announcement. After the ceremony, a young Navy SEAL approached. He couldn't have been older than 24. He stood straight and looked at Jack the way young men look when they are about to say something that has been sitting in them for a while and needs to come out carefully. "Sir?" Jack looked up. The young man's eyes moved to the exhibit and then back. He swallowed once. "I just wanted to thank you," he said. Jack frowned gently. "For what, son?" The young SEAL looked at him steadily. "For carrying them home." Something broke open in Jack Thompson so quietly that no one in the room could have seen it. Not a collapse, not a sound. Just the slow filling of eyes that had stayed dry through 52 years of impossible wait, finally releasing because someone young enough to be his grandson had said the one true thing Jack had needed to hear since the night he walked out of that jungle alone. He didn't look away. He didn't apologize for it. He just sat with it, the way a man sits with something he has waited a very long time to finally be allowed to feel. Rex rose from the floor and pressed himself gently against Jack's leg. Jack rested his trembling hand on the old dog's gray head. Outside the museum windows, American flags moved softly in the warm evening air. The light had gone golden, the way Florida light does at the close of a long day, generous and unhurried, laying itself across the world like a kindness. Jack looked at the photograph of his friend, at that wide-open laugh, at the young man who had turned back into the fire without hesitation so that others might live, at the two small carved letters that had waited 50 years in a dusty pawn shop for the right set of eyes to find them. "Don't let them forget us, brother." He hadn't. And in the keeping of that promise, in the long, faithful carrying of it through all the silent years, Jack Thompson had done something he had never once intended. He had carried himself home, too. Some men never march in parades, they never wear their medals, or tell their stories, or ask the world to stop and notice what they gave. They grow old quietly in small towns, with old dogs and older memories, carrying names the rest of us have long since forgotten. If you know a man like that, a father, a grandfather, a neighbor sitting alone on a porch watching the evening come in, sit with him, ask him, listen to him, because the stories he is carrying deserve to be heard while there is still time to hear them. If this story moved you today, please subscribe to Jack and Rex Tales. Every week we bring you stories of courage, loyalty, and the quiet dignity of lives fully lived. And if someone you love would find comfort and meaning in a story like this one, share it with them right now. It might be exactly what they need. This story carries educational and human value that reaches far beyond its emotion. It speaks honestly to the experience of Vietnam veterans, a generation of men who came home not to gratitude, but to silence, and in many cases to active dismissal. Men who gave everything and were then expected to be invisible about it. Jack's survivor's guilt is not a dramatic device. It is a documented psychological reality carried by countless veterans who lived when their brothers did not. A wound that can persist for decades without the right moment of acknowledgement to begin its easing. The story teaches that history lives inside objects in ways that are completely invisible to those without the knowledge to read them. Brad's carelessness was not malice, it was ignorance. And the story is deliberate in treating that distinction honestly, because ignorance corrected becomes understanding, while judgment only closes doors. It demonstrates the profound power of community memory, that veterans recognize each other across distance and time, that a single shared photograph can restore dignity to a forgotten name, and that the preservation of that memory is something worth active effort rather than passive hope. It shows children and grandchildren what their elders may be quietly carrying, and offers a model for how to approach those conversations with patience, curiosity, and genuine respect, rather than assumption or avoidance. And most deeply, it reflects a truth about healing that cannot be scheduled or forced. It arrives unexpectedly, through unexpected people, in rooms we never anticipated being in. Jack did not heal in 52 years of trying. He began to heal in a single moment, when a young man looked at him and said the true thing. Sometimes that is all it takes, and sometimes that is everything.